Hey, thanks for being with us today. We are going to be talking to you all about microgames, what they are, how they're used, and how what it was like to design one, and some of the pros and cons of that. Quick introductions. I'm Andrew Olson. I'm a research analyst at Center for Naval Analysis and a wargame
Hi.
designer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy. I am a research associate for the Institute of Defense Analysis, IDA. In addition to that, I'll tag on some of my other wargaming credentials. I am also a research associate for PAC Sims. I'm the co-chair for Connections Next Generation, and I'm also the head of programming for the Women's Wargaming Network.
We're gonna talk through some slides for you guys today about it. We'll tell questions till the end. Zach, do you mind throwing up those slides for us? I'm not sure if we're getting them. Great. As we said, we're professional wargame designers, both young to the field, but been enjoying it so far. So what are we doing today? Well, we're going to talk about what is a microgame. How are they used? What are the pros and cons of leveraging this particular format? We're going to walk through 2 different games that we each designed as an example of the process and the trade-offs involved in making them. And then we'll happily answer any questions you have at the end there.
Awesome.
Over to you, Betsy.
So first thing we want to do is actually talk about what is a microgame. Some of you might be wondering. So I've actually found 2 different descriptions, which I think is really cool, of what a microgame actually consists of. And the first one, probably more traditional one, or traditional description, is a microgame is a game where the instructions and the map are printed on technically one piece of paper. Even more technical than that, a 4x7 postcard. You see some images here on the slide. These are some classic depictions of what microgames can look like. They're small, as the name would imply, and they're easily playable. You don't need a facilitator for it. You should be able to pass these out, and the players should be able to understand the instructions and play in a very, very small space. So the second description of what I saw of microgames I think is really cool as well. It's any addition of a game with 20 components or less in a retail package of 20 cubic inches or less. One of the games that comes to mind when I think about that is maybe Deep Sea Adventures. Some of you might have played. So it's not necessarily a piece of paper or a board or a map per se, but it's small components, small pieces that are used together to play a very, very quick game. So these are 2 kind of really great descriptions of the games that Andrew and I have put together. Andrew, if you'll go to the next slide, we're going to touch a little bit on, the pros and the cons of the games, and, why would you want to do a microgame to begin with? Why would you want to design one? Why would you want to play one? So I'm going to skip the first 2 actually, because Andrew's going to do a deeper dive on the pro of the training quality and the outreach opportunity that these games present. But I really wanted to talk about player inclusivity and the timeliness of these games. These games are incredibly accessible and approachable, really, by anyone. I think that something we're really trying to do in wargaming right now is get new players to the game table and an increased player base of individuals who really want to play games and get to know more about games and hopefully even design new games. Sometimes when new players who've, never ever played a game before come to the table, open up the box, and they see a million different cutout pieces and a rule book that's 50 pages long, they say, yeah, I'm good. Never mind. I hear a lot of people say, I don't want to play a game that feels like work, or I don't want to play a game and look stupid. And when they see all of the multiple features and components this game consists of, that can actually deter them from wanting to get involved in the first place. This is a great opportunity for microgames to come in and save the day, I think. They're very, very simple games. They can be very strategic and complex at the same time, but they're small, they're accessible, they're manageable. Like I said, they don't necessarily need a facilitator. The instruction should be very plain, should be very simple, should be easy to understand and easy to play. And on top of that, the games can be played very quickly. These games are meant to be played during lunch. I think Andrew's going to talk a little bit about the opportunities of playing them at conferences or playing them or handing them out at conferences. These are meant to be played within maybe 15 minutes, 30 minutes, tops 45, right? So this is kind of a great way to get new players to the board And then on top of that, it's a great way for new game designers to exercise their game design skill. This is a craft, right? So this is a great way to get someone in who really wants to get into the wargaming world as a designer. This is a great place to start in order to kind of build that expertise in the field in and of itself. Quickly going to talk about cons as well. I think, and we're going to talk about this, one of the best features of a microgame are the parameters that it sets you up with, but obviously that can be a huge con as well. You have limited space. It's very, very difficult to take a concept and speak very plainly and simply about it, just straightforwardly put. Sometimes it's tempting to bleed over the parameters of what a microgame forces you to abide by, and that can be very, very difficult. One of the trade-offs that you have to make with that limited space is sacrificing sometimes external validity of the game. The internal validity of the game, the balance of the game mechanics needs to work, right? That's very, very important. But sometimes the features that you're looking to represent in real life, it's a little bit more difficult, right? So it forces you to create a simpler model. And I'm sure you've heard it plenty of times this week, no models work, some models are useful. We're definitely going to bring that up with microgames. And then there's the design challenge, which I see both as a pro and as a con. Andrew's going to touch on that. So I'm going to actually pass it back to him. He's going to touch on training and outreach. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the trade-offs later on. But with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Andrew.
Sounds good. Well, so one of the ways we've been leveraging microgames at CNA where I work is a training tool. Myself and a couple other young designers, when we joined, they told us, hey, in addition to all your usual stuff, carve out time. We're going to make you do a microgame as part of your training. And why make us do that given all of our other responsibilities? Well, it's a full self-contained design process. You have to take an idea, you have to simplify and figure out the model that you're trying to depict, whether that's an economic model or a political model or a model of warfare, break that down into a system that can be represented in the game, write the rules for that, which is always a challenge, particularly given spatial concerns we'll hit on again later, and then go through a full playtesting process. And so Christopher Ma, my boss, along with Sebastian Bay, kind of a mentor to the younger designers at CNA, made us do this. And so it's been an interesting way to kind of get one full design process all on my own as part of my initial entryway into CNA. One of the other good parts about the training is it forces us to make a simple game. You have to learn to break a complex system into a simple model, which we do regularly in war games. We can fudge a little bit when there's a facilitator, or we can fudge a little bit if there's lots of balancing, lots of tools, lots of systems around it. And so by forcing you to fit it all on this square piece of paper and have the rules written down beforehand, you can't facilitate through it. It's a good way to train us to think about, hey, how to make things clear, how to make things understandable, how to design an elegant system that can be played with a limited amount of pieces. We also, as mentioned here, had a design competition between the team, which is a great way for everyone to keep their design skills fresh. There's a little cash prize on the side, and we all competed to see who could have the best one. Ironically, the staff member who suggested it also ended up winning the competition, so good on them. But it was great to compete with my colleagues to see who can create the best microgame. So in addition to the kind of the training process, the other kind of business application of this is an outreach tool. Obviously, it's very portable. It's you can put it in your pocket, put it outside of a notebook, and kind of hand them out. And so you see over here to the right is the backside of my microgame Rolling Rockets, which we'll touch on more at the back end of this presentation. There's the designer notes here, but also big CNA logo. You like this game. You might be interested in war games. Here's what CNA does in this space. You can reach out to Jeremy Spinski or Chris Ma if you want to learn more about this. And so by having a game that I can hand to you, you can play and take home with you, show your friends and family. I've demonstrated that, hey, I know how to make games. I know how to make games about interesting topics that might be relevant to you. And now, instead of just giving you a business card, now you've got my contact information, and you'll see that every time we pull out the game. So it's a helpful little outreach tool. It's portable, easy to hand out, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, we'll both touch on this to some extent, but it's a worthwhile challenge to sharpen our design skills, right? because of limited space, we have to consider every rule. We can't have a whole booklet full of edge cases or clarifications or symbology. And so we have to think really seriously about, is this rule necessary? Is it worded in a way that covers as many, all the cases that I think are going to be relevant? And does it do it in a way that players can understand without me being here, right? Clear wording becomes even more key. You got limited space. You can't, have a three sentence explanation for how exactly your dice mechanic works sometimes, and so you got to figure out how to communicate clearly, which is always a challenge in all circumstances, even more so when you're writing rules. I find that I operate best with some constraints, and so by forcing us to work with fewer of the tools we might have in other circumstances, it can allow for creativity. How can I use pieces multiple way? How can my board spaces serve multiple functions? How can my rules explain multiple things at once? It's also worth noting that you have to balance with fewer tools because you don't have as many pieces, you don't have as much space, you don't have as many mechanics going often, and so you have to think about how do I balance a system with fewer ways to do it, which is always a worthwhile skill to polish, even if it can be very challenging when you have less tools to do so. And finally, for our visual design skills, because we have a limited space, we got to make sure that it's readable quickly. And so that's thinking about shapes and colors and all the tools of visual design to make sure that, hey, when I put this in front of a player, do they know what's going on? Is it have visual clarity? Does the play flow? Do people know where they need to put stuff when I don't have a bunch of different setup diagrams and stuff going? So over to Betsy to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of this approach.
First thing I want to say though, Andrew, you've just given me the brilliant idea of like creating business cards with microgames on the back of them, which I think is fascinating. So Andrew, if you go to the next slide, I think we've really touched a lot about, the necessity of these games having to be simple and how much of a challenge that actually is. So I want to bring y'all's attention to this picture that I've put on here of like a classic miniatures game, right? You see different types of terrain, you see trees, roads, buildings. You see someone has pulled out a measuring tape. Maybe he's measuring line of sight, firing range, something like that. This kind of game is meant to emulate realistic game features as much as possible. And that is something a microgame just cannot do. We have to pare back immensely, right? We've picked our purpose of the game and the lesson that we really want the game to surface or elicit from gameplay itself. But in the ways that our game mechanics are used to bring out that lesson, we have to make trade-offs. It's very, very difficult to align the internal validity of the game with the external validity of the game when you're challenged by the simplicity of the space itself. So systems are complex, right? And the topics that Andrew and I chose for our games are very complex. I chose climate change mitigation, right? That's not super simple. I think an example maybe of one of the trade-offs that I had to make, and when you see my game, which also is available on PackSims if you all ever want to download it and play it, you'll see that I'm looking at global greenhouse gases and ways to reduce them. And the way that I kind of measure these greenhouse gases increasing or being reduced are like 0% to 100% net growth. Any climate change scientist would go, well, that's not quite right. We look at parts per million and there's no such thing as 0% net growth. We're never going to reduce our global greenhouse gases to 0%, right? So subject matter experts are immediately going to see the holes in representing climate change mitigation accurately, right? But the game that's not the focal point of my game. Maybe that's not the purpose of my game. Climate change is a scenario and background, but you'll see in my game, it's actually much more about powers cooperating and competing with each other with climate change as the scenario, right? But it's about negotiation, semi-cooperative. It's not just about reducing global greenhouse gases. And I struggled a little bit with that at first. And a lot of my playtesters also commented on that. They're like, hey, you're using this ambiguous word of technology in your game that I can invest in that's going to help me reduce greenhouse gases later on as the game progresses. What does that mean? What do these pieces represent? And I tried to do a deep dive on that and actually name and give specifics to those pieces. But I quickly realized I was bleeding over my microgame parameters. And also the more specific that I got, the more detail everyone wanted. So I had to back up, and I had to say, I'm going to simplify this process, and that's going to be okay. That is going to be sufficient for me. Andrew, I'll pass it off to you to see if you had any similar stories to tell about rolling rockets and the trade-offs that you had to make.
Yeah, we'll hit on this a little bit in the walkthrough, but right, my game, which is about the smuggling of high-end missile parts into North Korea, it literally involves nukes, right? Enormously a complex topic. It also involves transnational climate cooperation, another kind of completely solved issue and simple problem set there. And so, as I've worked with our CNA staff, who are North Korea experts, or our nuclear proliferation staff, et cetera, figuring out, hey, like, how do I balance making sure that someone who is familiar with the topic understands it and feels seen, right? You don't want to end up turning off your specialized audience that you're trying to make the game for, or have an interaction with, by failing to understand the complexities involved. But also, I've only got so much space to kind of convey this system. And so it was a constant challenge of how do I, make nuclear proliferation simple, if you will. And so that was kind of a continual back and forth, which we'll hope to highlight a little bit in walkthrough.
So Andrew, I think at this point, we are actually going to jump into actually showing you all our games. So Andrew is going to talk a little bit about his thought process for making rolling rockets and taking it from concept all the way to execution into the gameplay itself. And then I'm going to do the same thing with turning tides. I'd also love to point out, not all micro games have to have alliteration in your title. Andrew and I just did that and didn't realize until later, which we think is actually kind of cool. But Andrew, go ahead, talk about rolling rockets.
Yeah. So Rolling Rockets came about for kind of two major reasons. One is the training mandate. I mentioned earlier that all of the CNA designers had to do one. And so I was noodling away at a couple ideas, including an autonomous movement game that really wasn't going anywhere. About the same time, some of our colleagues had a contact at INR who was looking to make a microgame or make a game that they could use as an outreach tool. They were looking to connect with some people at conferences, and they thought a war game would be a fun way to make that connection. So they said, hey, we've got these young designers who have some time on their hands and a mandate to design. You need a game. Let's see what we can do here. As many of you are probably aware, one of the first things that happens for professional war games is usually a sponsor request. The sponsor tells us, hey, we have a conversation. What do you need? What's this game about? What are you hoping to teach? What is hoping to do? And so we had a conversation with the INR staffer, and they're like, hey, we need a game that plays quickly, that I can bring to all the conferences that I'm going to. I need it to be cool enough that people will stop by and roll some dice with me, but not be so intimidated by all the bits and bobs and click-clacks on the table that they will not sit down and play. It needs to demonstrate an understanding of what the counterproliferation community does. Both so INR can start a conversation about their role within that, but also for those who are less familiar, to be able to understand why it is that this matters, or what different elements are bringing to this particular effort. After we clarify what the sponsor want, then it was time to try to figure out all of the questions involved with nuclear proliferation. How do these parts move that they're talking about? How do they get into the DPRK? What is the role of the counterproliferation community? INR certainly sent us some things, but we didn't want to just take their word for it. So I went around to our CNA colleagues, the good old Congressional Research Service, a little bit of Googling, a little bit of open source reporting. What is the academic understanding of the counterproliferation community? And then what tools do each side has? One of the key things to identify whenever you're designing a game is what is the decision space for any of the players or any of the actors in it. And so what tools does INR have, or the counterproliferation community have? What tools does the DPRK have in this particular dynamic? After we did that research, we got to find a model to display to the participants and break that down into a game. Having done the research, my impression was kind of the key resources or key decision space for the two actors. For the DPRK, it was funds. There's a limited amount of them, and they need to spend them efficiently to get what they want into the country. And on the other end, the counterproliferation community seems to be thinking a lot of their role as raising awareness in addition to implementation of sanctions or of an interdiction. But really what they needed to do was raise awareness every time there was a new pathway that was opened, or a new method of smuggling, or Cyber security started to get lax in different private sector partners. And so their role in my game, at least, is, hey, we got to raise awareness. Talking with kind of various practitioners, they kind of mentioned a lot this idea of a race or kind of a whack-a-mole dynamic involved in this, that every time there's a new method for getting a part in, whether that's smuggling it in a rice bale or whatever the current fancy solution is, or whether that's a kind of cybersecurity methodology or a cybercrime methodology, as soon as that happens, there's a kind of a ticking clock. How much can DPRK get done before this new method is discovered? And so basically one side's playing whack-a-mole and the other one's playing a race. Finally, I was very grateful that we were handed this wonderful slide as one of the presentations that they handed to me as kind of the conceptual nodes and steps involved in securing a part. And I said, that looks like an outline of a board game right there. I'll see what I can modify and start that off. So here is one of the kind of early attempts to translate all that information and all that research into a game. You can see in the center here, the DPRK is trying to move various blocks from kind of parts that they want and deliver it into country through various pathways. They've got some funds. Those are the little circles they can spend to re-roll dice to make sure that transfer happens or add pluses or bonuses to doing so. On the other end, you've got the counterproliferation community. In this case, it started out as INR. We decided that better to phrase it more as a unity of effort and not focus specifically on what INR does, but the whole community does. So that's one change that you'll see in later editions. But the blue player is writing both trying to do the short-term task of, I don't want these parts to go. I'm going to put efforts towards putting myself at these various choke points. But also at the same time, I'm playing this long game of, I got to raise awareness with commercial partners. I got to create coalitions. I got to get my interdiction efforts coordinated across borders and across services. And so those are the circles they're trying to fill in to do awareness. One of the things we fiddled with a long time is how much to give each player, either in funds or quickness of gaining awareness. You'll notice that the number of funds the DPRK gets will decrease across each of these different versions that you'll see coming up here. We also noticed that we had prevented a way from the DPRK to regenerate any funds. So sometimes they would ball out, just spend all their cash and then be unable to keep playing the game, which wasn't a great place to be. There's a realism in that there are limited funds, but there is ways to get more funds into country, whether that's taxes or cybercrime or other methodologies. So instituted a way for those funds to be regenerated, just erase the bubble after you take an action. There's a lot of rules rewriting. You'll notice that the format of our rules will change with a couple of versions here. As mentioned, really hard to cover all potentialities, all ways the players might go, given limited text. And so figuring out how exactly to make that elegant and simple was a constant challenge. You'll also notice over the course of this, we changed the color coding in various ways. Right, as mentioned before, it's got to be visually readable quickly, particularly for people who aren't super versed in war games. And so we'll play around with the color scheme over the go versions here. Here's a later version approaching towards the kind of second half of our play testing. You'll notice we changed all of the places the DPRK interact with the board into red, and changed all the places that the blue player interacts with to blue. We also instituted some color-coded cubes, although you can play really with any items. We shifted it so that the blue player can choose to pursue any of their objectives in the order that they chose. Previously, we kind of had a sequential series of awareness raising. Although there's literature to support kind of a sequenced approach to certain kinds of responses. For the game, we wanted to highlight that these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can choose to focus on criminal interdiction, or you can choose to focus on kind of commercial awareness, and that these things aren't mutually exclusive, and you can choose to pursue any of those bonuses, which is effectively what they are for the DPRK player or for the counterproliferation player at any time. And then you've got the green box up there. We eventually we got vetoed. I really liked the green. It was our setup color. However, it made some people a little queasy and kind of threw off the color scheme. So eventually we got rid of our green startup box. But for a while there, we played around with having all startup be green. Here's the final version, and we'll happily to talk about this again during the questions if you got more specific ones on how the games function. But right, same idea. Red is the red player, blue is the blue player. We changed, decreased the number of funds, played around with the awareness, added some rules clarification, tried to make the flow of play a little bit more clear, kind of going top to bottom, right? All parts start at the top, they flow down to the bottom box there, to help the players kind of instinctually understand what's going on. Look forward to answering any more questions about that, but here's an example, right, of taking an idea, turning it into a microgame, and then trying to make that a playable and enjoyable microgame from a sponsor request. Over to you, Betsy.
Thank you so much. I absolutely love Andrew's game. I think he did such a great job of capitalizing on space itself. And I think it's a fantastic example to show you all. My approach to the microgames was a little different because I didn't have a sponsor for this. I want to say that first and foremost. So I actually first heard about microgames. I was at a Women's Wargaming Network event. We had two game designers who are currently at CNA showcasing their microgames. I believe they were involved in the same contest, and they were looking for playtesters. And so I jumped in, and I was super impressed with the complexity that they were able to incorporate into such a small space of the game. And they kind of gave me a one-on-one, or this is what microgames are, and this is why we're using them, and this is what they can do. And, you know, you should go home and do one yourself. And I took that to heart, and I went home that night and started sketching out a schema. And I approached Sebastian Bay as in his seat as the faculty sponsor for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, Goose. And I said, hey, I've got this idea. I could really use some mentorship. Would you be willing to help me out? And he was kind enough to really take me under his wing and give me this opportunity. So I know that almost simultaneously CNA was doing this contest, and I was over here in the corner kind of doing it on my own with some mentorship and support from Sebastian, which I really, really appreciate. I'll actually even highlight a few pictures back, and you know, if this is when you look it up on YouTube, I'm sure you can see it later. But there's a picture of Andrew actually playtesting my game, which was so cool. So like in general, shout out to CNA and thank you guys for supporting me and helping me with my game. But since I didn't have a sponsor, it changed a little bit of the approach. So Andrew, if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of walk you guys through the way that I did this. So I say step 1, step 2, step 3 here. That's how I approached it. I'm not necessarily saying you have to do this first, you have to do the second, and you have to do this third. But when I wrote my schema out and I showed it kind of this loose sketch on a piece of paper, Sebastian, the first question that he asked me, he said, well, what is the point of your game? What is the purpose of your game? What are you trying to do here? When people come and sit down, play your game, finish it and walk away, what do you want them to think? What's the insight that they're going to get from this game? And that was core to the game design. So he said, this is great. I love your energy. This is fantastic. But before you really start working on a schema and working on the model, you need to back up and you need to figure out your purpose. And you need to be able to say it in one sentence. Not only is this kind of a helpful tool for approaching any game design period, it's key for a microgame because you have limited space, right? So your purpose, if you can't state it in one sentence, you're probably going to really struggle with the parameters of a one piece of paper, right? So that was the first thing I did. And I decided to do my game on climate change, and I'll talk about that a little bit on step 3 on the so what of the game. But the purpose of the game was to demonstrate competing interests between powers to reduce global greenhouse gases at a geopolitical level. That's my purpose. That's my one sentence thesis right there. Okay. Well, the next question Sebastian asked me was, okay, well, who's going to play the game? Who is the audience? You know, if you got to pick people to come and play the game, who do you want playing the game? And as I realized this was, you know, much more of an educational game, a policy game, I'm not looking at subject matter experts. I don't want climate change SMEs sitting down to try to learn something from my game. It's not going to be helpful for them. It might be fun for them. I'm sure they could point out a lot of holes for it, but this is much more on increasing literacy on a different topic, right? So I want students, maybe even policymakers to come and do this game. And then the so what? And step 1 and step 3 are really connected, right? What's the, you know, why should people play the game? The so what of making the game. And that helps you kind of figure out your topic and your purpose. I already knew what I wanted my topic to be, but I kind of had to be able to explain the so what of the game. And as I did research on the topic, I realized that obviously, not only is it just an important topic, it was largely underrepresented in game design world, right? So it was large demand for it, low accessibility for it. It was this perfect opportunity to create a game for it, which was actually fantastic. So I got my purpose, I have my audience, and then I kind of have my so what. And if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of lead us into making of the magic. So despite the fact it didn't have a sponsor, I still actually wanted to put it in this column because it is important and it does matter. Though I didn't have one, and so I didn't go through that same process that Andrew did, Sebastian was kind enough to kind of play a faux role of being the sponsor, but he still gave me the power to choose the topic, to choose the lesson. And that was really what was driving my data collection. So in another world, if you have a sponsor, they tell you what topic they want, they tell you what they want you to learn from it, that is already providing for you essentially your purpose of the game. They usually need to refine it and do a back and forth with the sponsor to get to that point. I didn't have that, right? So I'm doing this for me, I'm doing this for fun. And though I didn't have a sponsor, it's still really important. And I wanted to make sure that I highlighted that. So data collection. The purpose of your game is actually going to drive data collection of the game. Once you have that purpose, you need to start doing research on those elements so that you can address and answer and elicit the surface, elicit the lessons that the purpose of the game is supposed to bring out. So at IDA, we kind of address this as issues, sub-issues, sub-issues, and essential questions. I know other verbiage and lingo is used. That's the lingo that I'm going to use for now. And I'll show you in the next slide what that looks like. And then the third part that, into game design is choosing the model. And yes, that is going to be the hardest part, but it's actually not as hard as you think, because the data collection, which is driven by the purpose, is actually going to be the driving input for what your model needs to consist of. So on the next slide, I've given you a little bit of an example of what this could look like. This data collection is nowhere near exhaustive of what I did, but I'm just trying to give you a snapshot, an example of what it could look like. So you see my purpose there. But one of the issues that I have underneath that, okay, well, how are global greenhouses even reduced to begin with? You could even back it up and you could even do a bigger question. What are global greenhouse gases? What do they consist of? How many are there, right? These are questions you need to answer. To what degree do global powers care about global greenhouse gases? We've got which global powers care about greenhouse gas reduction? What gaps exist between these global powers to reduce greenhouse gases? And it's starting to churn out my essential questions here. What countries have the means and the interest to reduce greenhouse gases? And what incentives do these countries, governments, entities have to reduce greenhouse gases together or separately, right? So these questions that I'm looking to research, that I'm looking to answer, are actually providing input for what the game model needs to consist of. So based off these questions in and of itself, I know that I need a semi-cooperative and competition-based game, right? In order to set up that kind of scenario, there's going to be negotiation. Well, if there's negotiation, probably means I need more than 2 players, because that's not very fun. You're going to need 3. Well, if they're going to have incentives to negotiate, that means they each need separate victory conditions that consist of what a win looks like. But those objectives for each player probably need to overlap with one other player, right? So you're creating the incentives to work together and also creating the incentives to want to maybe work by myself, to win, if you will, by myself. If they're going to negotiate as well, it means they need something to negotiate with. I need commodities and resources in the game that the players can gain, that the players can lose, that the players can share, give away, right? So these are all different pieces that through my data collection are helping me get closer and closer to what the model needs to consist of and needs to include. And the data collection, remember, was driven by the purpose. So I'm going to say this at the end of this presentation as well, but purpose is everything. Start with your purpose, get it to one sentence, and that's really going to help you progress all the way into game design. So in the next slide, I'm actually going to show you guys the game. Now, this is on PacSims as a PDF. I did my best to take it from a PDF and try and copy it over to PowerPoint. It didn't work out exactly the way I wanted it to, so please feel free to check out the PDF version of it. But the front face of the game has actually got my game concept, how to win the game, my action order, and the potential moves that you can do in this game. it's a lot of words. It's more words than I want it to be. And in fact, every time I look at this, I want to go back and I want to change it. I want to simplify it even more. For my first microgame, I'll give myself a break. But I've got this first page of what the game consists of and how you're supposed to play it, right? So a little background, I've got 2025, IPCC has just published this comprehensive assessment report on the imminent dangers of climate change should global greenhouse gases remain at their current net levels. So the United Nations is turning to 3 government bodies that are not only contributing to the problem, but have the means, the interest, the ability to actually turn the tides by 2050. Excuse me, I am recovering from a cold. So this kind of gives you an idea of there's going to be 3 players in the game, and also gives you some background on the 3 players that I chose and why maybe I didn't incorporate other players, because they might not have the means to reduce global greenhouse gases on the same level as the players that I played. I did add a little bit of modularity to the game as well. I feel a coughing fit coming on. I really hope that doesn't happen. But there are 3 different players, and I have 3 different objectives for them. But you can actually go in and put in your own players and put in your own objectives as well, which I think is really cool. So on the other side of that page, you actually have your board. You see I've got my greenhouse gases, ways to reduce them, my color coding. You see the turn tracker. You see maybe different commodities that I've got in the game. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. There's a great explainer on this on PackSims. So if you are interested in knowing more, I strongly suggest that you guys actually go check it out there and read the explainer. And if you go to the last slide, I did have one extra page, and these are game pieces. Something that you guys might have seen on Andrew's game and his setup. He was like, grab 8 pieces of whatever you have around the house. I have seen people do this with this game as well. You don't actually have to cut these out. If you have paper clips, if you've got buttons, if you've got coins, you can still use that. But I think that's a really cool and great thing to build into your microgame, is that they don't have to cut out pieces, right? And be like, hey, just grab things around the house, grab things around you that make it easier to play. I knew I was going to need extra room specifically for the objective cards. So I went ahead and threw in game pieces and tried to fill this page up so that it wasn't just 3 cards. And since I had a little bit of room, I went ahead and added a frequently asked questions section as well. But realistically, and with this microgame, you really want to get it down to 1 piece of paper. So my game concept and the board, that's 1 piece. And then I technically do have this other, extra piece of paper. You can cut out pieces. Again, if I could do it again, I already see opportunities where I could play with space better and change things around. And I think Andrew's Rolling Rockets game is a great depiction of capitalizing on that space. But if this is the first time you're making a micro game, or you want to challenge yourself just to see if you can do it, don't worry about that, but really, really try to keep yourself to no more than 2 pages, with that second page that I have here maybe being like game pieces that you can cut out. So you can give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, but not too much. So like Andrew, I'm also happy to answer more questions about the game if anyone has any. But for our last slide, Andrew and I really just wanted to kind of highlight some of our lessons learned, things we would have told ourselves and to other new game designers who are starting this process. I've said it at least twice already, and I'm going to say it again. For me, purpose is everything. Even if you have a sponsor, I think the purpose of the game can be very difficult to figure out, to sit down and agree on in 1 sentence. So if you're doing this on your own, make sure you're really, really clear about the purpose of your game. If you do have a sponsor, make sure they're both on the same page about what the purpose of that game is. Parameters, they can be challenging, but they offer such a great starting point, and they offer actually a comfort of constraints, if you will, to what you can do with your game. We are painters, painting on canvas. This is a trade craft. This is a skill. And just like painters, sometimes we don't know when to stop, right? And for new game designers, I think it's great to say, this is where you can go. This is as far as you can go. Because sometimes if we don't know what we're doing, next thing you know, we've covered the entire floor in a bunch of pages that might not make a lot of sense to anybody other than us. So as a starting point, it's actually really great to limit yourself. Manage your playtesting session, but not your playtesters. I could talk about playtesting all day. But something that I wish that I would have done is, instead of having my playtesters play the game and then say, what do you think? I wish I would have gone in and said, thank you so much for playing. So I created this part of the game to reflect this component or this realistic feature, or to teach this lesson, or to help get across the purpose of the game. Did it do that for you? Was that confusing? How could I make that clearer, right? Go in with targeted questions. Don't necessarily just ask them what they think, because then they'll tell you and they might not stop, right? Don't always listen to the feedback. I did a lot of back and forth of trying to take everyone's ideas in, and that was not a great way to do playtesting either. I would change one component of the game, then I would go back, then I would change it again, then I would go back. Take feedback in, take it all in, but ask targeted questions and make changes that are going to help improve the game, not just because someone else thinks it's a good idea. Plagiarize. Everybody does it. Peter Perlis says that, if you can play it, you can design it. And I absolutely believe that. Especially if you're going in with a specific topic in mind, research other games on that topic to see how other game designers approach that same thing. Obviously, don't riff off of someone's game 100%, but maybe take 20% here, 10% there, 5% here, and create your own model. But plagiarize. Use game mechanics from other games. I'm a big fan of that. And practice. This is trial and error. Again, I think, and this kind of bleeds into my last topic here, is get to play test as fast as you can. That's another thing I would have done. Just put it down on a piece of paper. Use whatever you have in your house as pieces. Use pieces from old games if you have them around, but just practice it, trial and error it. You'll see that in both Andrew and Designs games, I think he had funds that he was kind of trying to figure out how much should exist. For me, it was, from 0 to 100%. Should it be 20% increases, 25% increases, 10% increases? When it came down to funds, how much should there be? How much should technology investments cost? The balance of those mechanics, that didn't happen until playtesting. I'm not a statistician. I didn't sit down and figure out the math right beforehand. It was through playtesting the balance of my mechanics really came into being. So with that said, those are all my lessons learned. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you to talk about Rolling Rockets.
Yeah. Echo everything Betsy said there, particularly the primacy of playtesting. One of the ones that we found after playing it multiple times is, although we endeavored to have kind of a race and a whack-a-mole mechanic, given how I balanced the dice rules and the things, it could end up being about like an hour game, which is a little longer than either the sponsor wanted or I wanted. And since part of the reason for this game was to facilitate conversations, sacrificing some, kind of pure balance or accuracy to make the game come to a satisfying conclusion quicker was a trade-off worth making. And so we rebalanced it such that it could play in about 20 minutes and you could get on to the what did this demonstrate right, what did this demonstrate wrong about it. We had the lucky circumstance where I both had a lot of access to expertise, and also was given part of my model off the top of time, but given previous experience, if it's a new topic or a difficult topic or a complex topic, make sure that you give yourself enough time to make sure you understand the model, kind of proportional to how complex it is or how fleshed out it is. Make sure you give time for that. Purely by experience, I found that because we were targeting a population that didn't have a lot of exposure to war games on their topic, they were much more forgiving of kind of small tweaks or small dings than others. So if you're looking to design your own, perhaps choose an area that isn't as gamed yet, and you might find your audience to be more forgiving because you'll be the first, and therefore there's less to compare it to. Finally, this is more of those who will be working either in bureaucratic organizations or organizations that have a standard process. And because this is part of my work, I found that I did not budget sufficient time for all of the coordination that was required for working with artists, which is a key part of working with wargamers, whether that's having your friend do some artwork for you, which I've done before, or having colleagues do that. They require just as much time as you do to do their work, and make sure you're planning accordingly. And then finally, I was really grateful for my team. This really wouldn't have been able to be done without people working with me at lunch, giving their time and expertise, And so team support in all things is great. That's all I had for those. Happy to kind of answer more questions as they come up. And thank you for being with us today. We'll ask any questions that you would like. All right. I've got one pop up here. Where do I go, or who do I talk to about learning to design microgames? I'm gonna throw that one to Betsy because I think you have a little bit of experience in this particular topic.
I would say it's me. I didn't go through a course myself. I really honestly got exposed to it because I was involved in Women's Wargaming Network, and because we were blessed enough to have two people who were at CNA doing the contest who wanted to talk about it at the Women's Wargaming Network. So I haven't actually seen a course on it yet. I think that this presentation in and of itself might be the closest thing that exists thus far to it. So I'm really glad that it's going to be accessible to other people online whenever they want to learn more about what these are and how to do them. We do have on the next slide, actually, Andrew and I's Twitter information if you wanted to reach out to us. So feel free to touch base with us. We're happy to mentor or help anyone, because we received help on our games, and I think that we're both looking for opportunities to kind of pass that along, if we will, if anyone's interested in doing the same thing. But I haven't seen a course on it yet. I would say get involved in gaming organizations, whether that's Goose, Women's Wargaming Network, Connections Next Generation, also does game jams, which is very much trying to amplify the use of microgames because they're so simple. They're easy to play. I'm not gonna say they're easy to design, but in a quick time and in like maybe 2 hours, very intensely working with a group of people, I've seen people throw together a microgame before. It's very, very cool. I know at IDA, we're about to do a similar process with microgames and getting our entry-level game designers into making their own game. We're not going to do it a contest like CNA, which is really cool, but maybe we'll get to that level someday. But right now, we just want to showcase this more. I think that I said it a little bit in the slide as well. They enjoyed a lot of popularities in the 80s, but they're really showing a resurgence now. So maybe this is the call for there to be a course, a more targeted course on something like this in the future. But right now, I don't know of one. So please feel free to reach out to Andrew and I if you're interested in doing one yourself, which I absolutely endorse and encourage everyone to do.
Just jumping on, I believe also there has been a recent, and I apologize, I wasn't able to find it with the quick Googling, but if you Google a microgame or like postcard game competition or compilation, I believe there's a gentleman, kind of a game reviewer through YouTube or Twitter, who's been compiling submissions and reviewing them, which would be another place to look for previous examples. There we go, postcards in the front, right there. Thank you.
Nice.
For other examples of people taking this format and taking it to interesting places, less necessarily teaching, but certainly useful for other examples.
So I see another pop-up. How do you avoid bias caused by data selection? I don't think you can ever really avoid bias, to be honest. I think that the purpose of your game is actually what's going to help you try to avoid that as much as possible. Your purpose in and of itself could have bias in it, right? But if you're, and Andrew, I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to pass it over to you as well to kind of speak to this. I think it's very, very difficult to avoid biases. But depending on what your purpose is at the game, that's really going to drive what kind of data that you're looking for. In all cases, it's always a good idea to get a variety of data, to use a variety of sources. And if you are around subject matter experts, or if you have any sort of connection or exposure to them, it's such a great idea to go to them with this topic and say, hey, I want to do a game on this thing. Where should I be drawing my resources from? This is what I've found. In your professional expertise and experience, is this good data to use? Is this okay to use? Because if you're not using good data, or if it is largely biased, your playtesters are going to notice and bring it up. And obviously, if you ever get the chance to publish it or really bring it about in players, they're going to notice it and bring it up as well. So you want fidelity in your sources, but avoiding bias 100%, I think, is very difficult to do. Andrew, I'll let you answer that as well.
Yeah, I think Betsy said it well. I think the other kind of thinking about this for Rolling Rockets, as I mentioned, two of my other peers got the similar mandate to design a game for INR. We all chose different models, right? As we said at the top, no model is correct, but some models are useful, right? And so one of my colleagues chose to depict this not as I did as a series of kind of conceptual nodes, but rather as geographic steps, right? How does a part literally get from one location to the other? Someone else, one of my other colleagues, Sarah Chen, who was an intern with us at the time, leveraged it as looking at shipping companies in particular. And so they chose a data set that looked at how does the commercial sector, how do shell companies, how does global finance play into this? And so depending on what you're trying to depict will determine, or what angle or what portion of it, right? What part of the model, what part of the complexity you're trying to show. The challenge with a microgame, right, is you cannot, all games cannot manage the full complexity, but even more so, you're probably choosing a subsection of things. Earlier, you saw a game that Sebastian Bay designed called, originally called Bomb Diggity. I believe the name's been changed now, but that's the carrier game. And obviously, carrier operations, carrier strike group operations, a very complex topic. He just wanted players to understand kind of what various aircraft did. And so, none of the complexities of flight ops, none of the complexities of detection, none of the complexities of targeting are in there. It's just, hey, here's 4 different units. Here's generally what they do. So you, as my student at Georgetown or as my Marine, can understand what a P8 does, what a growler does in the Vegas concept. And so a little bit of your purpose is going to choose what data you select. Bias is inevitable. And as Betsy said, there's ways to mitigate that in any kind of professional research context.
And I'll add to that as well. The purpose that we obviously picked complex systems. Microgames don't have to be that way, though. I have a colleague of mine who's also getting ready to do a microgame, and he's got a much bigger game in mind that he wants to start designing down the road. And he wants to take the microgame as a way to test and exercise one mechanic out of that game, right? So in that way, it's actually pretty targeted and specific. It won't be super abstract. He's not taking an entire system. He's using a microgame almost as an outline tool for a much larger game that he has down the road. And so, yeah, Andrew talked about earlier about how this is such a great training tool for new game designers, but it's also a really great tool to use by maybe more experienced game designers who are either looking to challenge themselves and simplify a system and see if they can do it, but also maybe to take a very specific and targeted component of maybe a larger game they have down the road and use the microgame model to test that out and see how it works. So it could be abstract, it could be specific. I hope that answers the current pop-up question that we're looking at right now. Great. Are there any other, here's another question. After the sponsor makes the request, how do sponsors react to you when you recommend a microgame? Andrew, I'll let you take that.
Sure. So in this case, they were very open to it, given their desire for a outreach tool. And so when we're like, hey, you seem to want to do this at a conference, you have limited baggage space and limited setup time. This seems like this maybe would be an opportunity to leverage this format. They were also open because we're doing this for free for them. And so we had a little bit of like, this is what we'll give you. Does that sound good? They're like, it's a free business card for me. Sounds good. The gentleman we were working with was familiar with wargaming in general, and so had a passing understanding of how much kind of bigger DoD war games do cost, and certainly did not want to leverage that amount of money for this particular option. So the format matched up well. I think in other cases, I wouldn't CNA likes to say we design custom war games, and so if the sponsor has a request that is not best fulfilled by a microgame, then we would not recommend a microgame. And so I think it'll depend on what the sponsor needs. Thankfully, there was a matchup in this particular case.
I absolutely think it depends. Speaking as someone who didn't have a sponsor, the audience, right? The audience of who's playing the game is really going to matter. I was talking about microgames recently online with a few individuals, and there was someone, I believe it was from the Naval War College, who was like, I am looking to use something like this for a class. I need something that I can do in 50 minutes. This is such a great thing. I didn't know it existed. And it's like, great, your audience sounds like it would be perfect for that based on education and based on time. So it works for them, right? But if a sponsor comes in and he's like, this is my capstone war game, and I'm looking to bring in 50 people, and I want it to be over 3 days, maybe microgame's not the best, right? So it really depends on the purpose of the game and the audience of the game. from my perspective, though I did not have a sponsor. I think that is actually the end of our questions. If there's nothing else, we just want to thank you guys for signing on and listening to us talk about microgames. Like I said, my game is actually accessible online. If you want to download it, print it, play it, I would absolutely love for you to do that. Feel free to give me your feedback. And if you guys are interested, we did have our Twitter information up. You can find us on Twitter. And we strongly encourage you to reach out to us because we had some great mentors for this process. And we're absolutely looking for opportunities to pass that on. So please feel free to touch base with us, follow us, see what else we're doing. More microgames to come, we promise. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for your time.